Welcome to my TWU classmates. This is a podcast on Jerome Bruner and his educational theories. Jerome Bruner is one of the most prominent psychologists of the 20th century. In 1960, he wrote a landmark book called The Process of Education. This book had a direct impact on policy formation and influenced the thinking and orientation of a wide group of teachers and scholars. Bruner's research in cognitive development led to one of the early theories in constructivism. Constructivism is a very broad conceptual framework with numerous perspectives. Bruner's theory represents just one of these particular perspectives. Constructivist theory rests on the assumption that knowledge is constructed by learners as they attempt to make sense of their experiences. Growing up in Ohio, I had an 8th grade history teacher that must have shared the ideals of Jerome Bruner and the constructivist theory. My history teacher used to tell us that his greatest dream for us in his classroom was that we learn how to learn. Jerome Bruner believes that the aim of education is to make the learner as autonomous and self-propelled a thinker as possible. I think my personal perspective on teaching and learning was formed in that 8th grade history classroom, where rote memorization was not as important as participating in debates and role-playing historical events to enhance our understanding. To understand the impact of Bruner's theory on education, I need to briefly touch on his theory of cognitive growth. Bruner believes that people move through 3 stages of cognitive development in the way the mind is used to translate experiences into a model of the world. First, we go through the inactive stage. That's what we do in early childhood, where learning occurs through movement or action, basically muscle memory. It involves a series of actions that are right for achieving some result. Like a baby learning that shaking a rattle they can make the sound, or putting your hands over a baby hands and going through the motions of patty cake. They learn how to do that by simply mimicking that motion that has been taught to them. By middle childhood, we can learn through images. It's called iconic memory. And you'll learn through graphs, charts, watching videos. Basically, you're able to form a mental picture in your mind by that time. As you move into adolescence, you're capable of symbolic learning. This is more abstract learning by simple language, or you're capable of abstract, discretionary, flexible thought, can start to do research projects, listen to lectures and know what the meaning is without actually seeing the pictures. An example of an elementary teacher using these 3 stages to teach a lesson may be if she's going to teach a unit on dinosaurs, she'll start with having them make a model of the dinosaur, do some hands-on stuff. Then she may show a video about dinosaurs or show some type of graphs, how tall they were, how big they were. And then she may have the students access the internet to research more information about the dinosaurs and find out some of the causes that made the dinosaurs extinct. These 3 modes of representation, the inactive, iconic, and symbolic, are not distinct, separate stages. We don't move through a stage and leave the last one behind. Dr. Hannum stated in his podcast on Bruner that it's really more of an accumulation of knowledge. You start with hands-on lesson for inactive, you build on it with the iconic, and finally you get to the symbolic learning. Bruner believes that even adult learners that are completely capable of symbolic learning still benefit from hands-on learning and the use of visual aids along with the lecture. So some learning won't even reach the symbolic stage. For example, think of a welder who's learning how to weld 2 pieces of metal together. The student needs to perform the correct motor responses and visual representation to be able to complete the weld, but he really doesn't have to understand the inner workings of how a welder operates to perform the task. Professional athletes and musicians are examples of superior inactive learners, and an artist is a great iconic learner. An example of how these 3 modes may be used in nursing school. For the inactive, let's say we're going to teach a unit on just how to teach a student how to take a blood pressure reading. First, we're going to show them the equipment, let them, get familiar with the sphygmomanometer, how to, pump it up. Maybe even use a double stethoscope and let the student hear his or her own blood pressure as you take it. Then maybe we'll show a video on proper cuff placement, and it shows an animation of what the blood is doing in the arm during inflation and deflation. Explain the difference between systolic and diastolic. Then we're going to go into the symbolic. We're going to really discuss the importance of blood pressure in the human body, the physiology that goes with it. Make sure that each student understands what hypo and hypertension is and what these conditions do in the human body. Then we're going to come back to inactive learning. We want them to practice the skill and practice the skill. And finally, we'll check them off with a double stethoscope, making sure that they are able to take an accurate blood pressure. So now you see how these three modes work together to be able to teach even an adult learner. Now let's get to how all of this affects instruction in the classroom. Bruner believes that learning is a very active process in which the student is directly involved in the manipulation of the content in the three modes of representation. To be successful in learning new content, learners must be actively involved in the process, not just sitting quietly and listening to a teacher explain something. So Bruner emphasized 4 characteristics of effective instruction, which all emerge from his theoretical constructs. First, there is the readiness or predisposition for learning. Instruction basically has to be personalized to relate to the learner's predisposition, facilitate interest towards learning. It must be concerned with the experiences and contexts that make the student willing and able to learn. Bruner believes that a child of any age is capable of understanding complex information. We begin with the hypothesis that any subject can be taught effectively in some intellectually honest form to any child at any stage of development. An example of this might be, can you teach physics to an elementary student? Well, you can't teach them to calculate complicated formulas or make diagrams, but you could show them set up bowling pins and they're going to roll this little ball towards it. They understand if they throw the ball harder, they can get more pins to fall down. So that's a basic introduction to physics, even though they're not able to put it into any type of formula or diagrams. The next characteristic of effective instruction relies on content structure. Bruner believes it's possible to structure knowledge in a way that enables the learner to more readily grasp information. And this is where he brought up the concept of spiral curriculum. You involve information being structured so that complex ideas can be taught at a simplified level first, then revisited at more and more complex levels later on. So basically, you're going to teach your people at levels of gradually increasing difficulty. Ideally, teaching this way will basically lead kids to being able to solve problems by themselves. The third characteristic of effective instruction is sequencing. And sequencing is an important aspect for the presentation of the material. Bruner believed that the best learning occurs when lessons are geared in a fashion that moves in a progression from the inactive to iconic to symbolic stages. And we kind of touched on that already as we talked about his cognitive development. The last characteristic of effective instruction really centers around reinforcement. Rewards and punishments, they should be selected and paced appropriately. Most people think of a concept of reinforcement as an external reinforcement, or providing the student with a reward for learning something to motivate them. In Hannum's podcast, he indicated that Bruner saw this as an artificial and short-term gain at best. When that external reinforcement goes away, so does the learning, and a teacher can't always be there to provide that reinforcement or reward. So for Bruner, he believes it's better to skip these extra reinforcers and rely instead on the intrinsic motivation of students, which is neither artificial nor contrived. By designing the curriculum around interesting problems and engaging the students and discovering the meaning through direct manipulation of objects, images, and symbols, you basically appeal to the student's internal or intrinsic motivation. A student is learning not in order to get an external reward, but rather because the process of learning itself is so much fun. The reinforcement Bruner wishes to engage in is that reinforcement that's inherent in the process of discovery learning. And discovery learning is obtaining knowledge for oneself. Basically, it's a planned or guided execution of the trial and error method of learning. When I think of discovery learning, I think of how quickly students pick up on video games. They play a game and they try a few things and go, oh, that didn't work, so I'm going to try something else. And pretty soon they are just going level by level by level through the increasing difficulty of the game. And they've learned this on their own by discovering what works and what doesn't work. And education should be very similar according to Bruner. Many of Bruner's ideas remain influential in schools today, including learning through discovery, the use of manipulatives, having students work together on projects, portfolio assessment, science labs, the student as experimenter, the teacher as guide or coach rather than a lecturer, and active learning. The website Developmental Approaches to Learning sums up some of the pros and cons of Bruner's theory in the classroom pretty well. Positives, they pointed out, was that it's great that students can construct an understanding of concepts based on previous knowledge, that they discover and generate their understanding based on discovery. The concepts are presented in that spiral manner so that concepts build one upon the other. The students are actively involved in their own education, and that manipulating, handling, viewing, and discussing concepts allows multiple avenues for students to input concepts in their memory. Limitations, though, can be a challenge for students working at their own pace to discover concepts on their own. Teachers have to help overcome this by guiding learners to make discoveries. And it may be difficult for a teacher to always be present to present students with visual cues. Hands-on manipulatives might be expensive, not always possible for teachers or schools to be able to purchase those to help promote student understanding of concepts. And in courses that have limited time and lots of curriculum to cover, it just may not be possible for the teachers to always sequence the lessons to ensure that all those learning gaps are filled in. So to conclude, I want to share with you advice that Jerome Bruner gave me. Yep, at age 96, he is still working as a research professor of psychology at NYU and a senior research fellow at NYU School of Law. I emailed him there to ask him if he had one piece of advice for me about how to teach adult learners. His response was, "That's a hard question to answer, Angela. I guess I'd encourage them to think about possibilities. What might provide alternative ways of looking at a problem? After all, that's what good thinking is about. Not just finding the right answer, but searching for possible answers. And there are different ways of going about it, both the logical, scientific way and the literary way, and they serve to enrich each other." Thank you for listening, and that's it for the podcast on Jerome Bruner.